On the 24th of February, President Donald Trump delivered his annual State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. This is a really useful example you can use in your A-level politics essays for a formal power of the presidency. In the US Constitution, as part of the separation of powers, the key legislative powers in the United States political system are given to Congress rather than the Supreme Court or the presidency. Only Congress can introduce legislation and pass legislation, and even though the president gets a veto over that legislation, the president ultimately has limited kind of formal written down legislative powers in the Constitution. One of the powers that they do have, though, is known as the State of the Union Address, and this allows them to go to Congress once a year and address a joint session of Congress, so both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and effectively its role is for the president to be able to formally recommend legislation to Congress that they want to be passed. This is therefore an example you can use of the formal powers of the presidency, the formal legislative powers of the presidency. Unusually, though, in this year's State of the Union address, Trump kind of didn't introduce many new policy initiatives. He did endorse the Save America Act, which would require photo ID and proof of citizenship to vote whilst restricting mail-in ballots. And he also announced that in trade policy, following a Supreme Court ruling that struck down his earlier tariffs, he'd rely on Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose a baseline 15% tariff without immediate congressional approval. So introduce some kind of key policy initiatives. But normally presidents come and really formally recommend key piece of legislation they want to be passed that align with their key policy initiatives, potentially ones that they promised in their election campaign. But instead, Trump kind of really focused on defending his administration's achievements record so far and criticizing the Democrats, who he described as crazy and responsible for destroying the United States. So he promoted the achievements of 2025, particularly the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, but offered no major new economic or legislative proposals for 2026. So this is a good example you could use of the formal powers of the presidency. So you could use it in your 12 markers, or your 9 markers, whether you do Edexcel or AQA. And in some ways, you could use it as an example of the effectiveness of the formal powers, because Trump was able to go there and formally recommend legislation, or the ineffectiveness, as ultimately Trump wasn't able to kind of pass any legislation because he doesn't have that kind of formal power to introduce legislation. And he didn't really use it to introduce or recommend legislation. He really used it instead to kind of really criticize the Democrats. For examples like this in your inbox every single week, go to the Politics Explained website and subscribe to our newsletter, and where you can also find our US example pack for 2026.